This is a story about love, after everything. Tell me where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. People don't fear power, someone once said. They fear the person who controls it without raising their voice. The glass doors of Carter's grand dining hall slid open with a soft hush. And just like that, the entire room changed. Conversations dimmed, silverware slowed, and even the soft jazz playing in the background seemed to hesitate for half a second, as if the air itself needed permission to continue. She stepped in without rushing, heels measured, posture flawless, the kind of presence that didn't demand attention but owned it anyway. And in a room full of million-dollar deals and tailored suits, every single person instinctively adjusted themselves, back straighter, voices lower, eyes carefully avoiding hers. Emily Brooks noticed it all from across the room, her hands steady as she set down a glass of water at table 12, her expression calm, unreadable, almost detached, like someone watching a scene she had already seen before. She didn't look away when the woman walked in, didn't lower her gaze like the others, didn't pretend to be busy. She simply watched, quietly, thoughtfully, as if she were reading something no one else could see. The woman, tall, elegant, dressed in a cream silk dress that probably cost more than Emily made in a month, paused near the entrance, scanning the room with a subtle, almost surgical precision, and wherever her eyes landed, people reacted, a nervous smile here, a stiff nod there, a manager rushing forward just a little too quickly. "Ms. Laurent, welcome back," the manager said, his voice just a shade too careful. "Your table is ready." And she nodded once, not warmly, not coldly, just enough to remind everyone she had heard him, and that was all that mattered. Emily picked up a set of polished forks from the service station, her fingers brushing the cool metal, her eyes flicking back toward the woman. Victoria Laurent, the billionaire's fiancée, the one people whispered about in the kitchen when they thought no one important was listening. The one who had made a senior waiter quit mid-shift last week with nothing more than a sentence spoken too softly to be overheard. Emily had heard the stories. Everyone had. But stories were noise. And Emily didn't trust noise. She trusted details. The chair slid back at the head table. As Victoria took her seat, her movements precise, controlled, like every gesture had been practiced until it became effortless. And a second later, the room shifted again as Daniel Carter entered. His presence different, heavier, not feared in the same way, but respected, undeniable. The kind of man who built empires with decisions made between sips of espresso. He greeted a few guests with a nod, a brief smile, completely unaware, or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge, the tension that had already settled before him. Emily watched him too, just for a moment, noting the contrast, the way he moved through the room with ease while the space around Victoria seemed to tighten, compress, as if it were being held in place. She approached their table with the same steady pace she used for every guest, placing the napkins, aligning the glasses, her movements efficient, almost invisible, but her attention sharp. Victoria adjusted the position of a wine glass by less than an inch, and the manager immediately stepped forward to correct it further, as if that tiny adjustment had exposed a flaw no one else had noticed. Emily set down the forks last, one by one, the faint clink of metal against porcelain barely audible, and for a fraction of a second, her hand paused, not enough for anyone to call it hesitation, just enough for her to feel the weight of something that didn't quite fit. She glanced up, meeting Victoria's reflection in the polished surface of the table rather than her eyes. Directly, and something about the way the woman's fingers rested on the edge of the table, the angle, the tension, the almost imperceptible shift as she adjusted her grip, lingered in Emily's mind longer than it should have. Daniel began speaking, his voice smooth, confident, discussing an upcoming acquisition, and Victoria responded with a small, approving smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, her attention divided. Always calculating, always aware, Emily stepped back, blending into the rhythm of the room. But her gaze returned once more, not out of curiosity, not out of fear, but out of something quieter, something sharper, the instinct of someone who had learned that the smallest inconsistencies often carried the biggest truths. Around her, the restaurant resumed its flow, conversations rising again, laughter cautiously returning, but the tension never fully left. It lingered beneath the surface, subtle, controlled, waiting, and Emily, standing just a few feet away with a tray balanced effortlessly in her hand, felt it settle into place like a puzzle missing only one piece. Because sometimes the difference between who someone is and who they pretend to be isn't hidden in what they say, but in the smallest movement of a hand, the slightest shift of a fork, the detail no one else thinks to question. And for the first time that evening, Emily didn't just observe the woman everyone feared. She began to understand her. The room had returned to its rhythm, but Emily knew better than to trust appearances. Calm was often just tension that had learned to behave. She moved between tables with quiet precision, refilling glasses, clearing plates, her presence almost invisible, yet her attention remained fixed on one table, one pair of hands, one detail that refused to settle in her mind. Victoria Laurent lifted her wine glass again. Her fingers curved elegantly around the stem, controlled, deliberate, but there it was again, that slight adjustment, that fractional hesitation before her grip settled, as if her body needed to remember something it should already know. Emily did not stare. She never stared. Instead, she let her gaze pass naturally, like any other server scanning the room. But each time she passed their table, she collected another piece, another quiet inconsistency. Daniel Carter leaned back slightly in his chair, speaking with confidence about numbers that would intimidate most people in the room, percentages, projections, acquisitions measured in millions, his voice steady, assured, the voice of a man who had built certainty into his life. And yet, sitting across from him, Victoria responded with the kind of attentiveness that felt practiced rather than natural, her nods perfectly timed, her smiles precise, her reactions just a fraction too aligned with what was expected. Emily noticed the way she held the knife when the main course arrived, the angle slightly off for someone who had been raised in the world she claimed, the way she adjusted her posture before each interaction, not unconsciously, but intentionally, like someone following a script only she could hear. A customer at a nearby table let out a quiet laugh, breaking the tension for a moment, and Emily used it as cover to step closer, setting down a fresh glass of water. Still or sparkling? She asked, her voice soft, neutral, professional. Still, Victoria replied. Without looking at her, her tone smooth, controlled, and yet her hand moved again, adjusting the fork Emily had placed earlier, rotating it slightly to the right. Emily's eyes flicked down for less than a second, enough to confirm what she already suspected, then back up, her expression unchanged. Daniel noticed the exchange this time, just barely, his gaze shifting between the two women, curiosity flickering for a moment before being buried under habit. He was not a man who missed details, but he was a man who chose which details mattered. "You have a very attentive staff," he said, almost casually, glancing at Emily. She nodded once, stepping back. "We try to notice what others overlook, sir," she replied, her words simple, but the weight behind them lingered longer than expected. Daniel studied her for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, something in her tone catching his attention. But before he could respond, Victoria's hand touched his wrist lightly, redirecting him back into the conversation, her smile returning, flawless, effortless, controlled. Emily moved away, but not far, her mind already assembling the pattern, the small contradictions aligning into something clearer, something harder to ignore. In the service hallway, the noise of the dining room softened into a distant murmur, replaced by the quiet clatter of dishes and the low hum of staff conversations. "Table 1 is intense tonight," one of the servers whispered, shaking his head. Emily did not respond. She rarely joined in, but she listened, always listening. She corrected the wine pairing twice, another added, like she memorized it 5 minutes ago. Emily dried her hand slowly, her thoughts narrowing, focusing, replaying each movement she had seen, each detail she had felt but not yet named. A memory surfaced, uninvited but sharp, a conference room from years ago, a woman standing at the front, confident, articulate, explaining identity fraud detection to a room full of professionals, her voice clear, her examples precise, and most importantly, her demonstration unforgettable. The way she showed how people revealed themselves not through grand mistakes, but through small, repeated inconsistencies in behavior, in habit, in muscle memory. Emily had been younger then, sitting in the back, unnoticed, absorbing every word, every technique. Every lesson about how truth had a pattern and deception had to keep adjusting to maintain itself. She blinked, returning to the present, the connection settling into place. Back in the dining room, Victoria laughed softly at something Daniel said, the sound perfectly measured, not too loud, not too soft, just enough to signal engagement. And as she reached for her fork again, Emily saw it clearly now, not just a detail, but a contradiction that did not belong. She stepped forward once more, this time with intention disguised as routine, carrying a small plate, her movements as fluid as ever, her expression calm. But beneath that calm, something had shifted. She was no longer just observing. She was testing. She set the plate down gently, adjusting the arrangement of utensils with practiced care, and for the briefest moment, she rotated the fork slightly to the left, aligning it in a way that would feel natural only to someone who used that hand instinctively. Then she stepped back, her eyes lowering respectfully, her presence fading once again into the background. Daniel continued speaking, unaware, or perhaps only partially aware, his attention divided between business and something else he had not yet defined. Victoria glanced down at the table, her eyes scanning, her hand moving automatically to correct the placement, and then she stopped, just for a second, just long enough for someone who was not looking for it to miss it completely, but not long enough to escape Emily's notice. The fork remained where it was for a heartbeat longer than it should have, and in that single, quiet hesitation, Emily found the confirmation she had been waiting for, because sometimes the truth does not arrive loudly or dramatically. Sometimes it reveals itself in the smallest pause, the briefest uncertainty, the moment when a carefully constructed identity forgets which version of itself it is supposed to be. Daniel Carter had built his life on certainty, on patterns that could be predicted, controlled, and optimized, but something about the past few minutes refused to fit into any model he trusted. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers resting against the edge of the table, his gaze no longer fixed on the conversation, but drifting, returning again and again to the quiet figure moving through the room with effortless precision. Emily Brooks did not draw attention, and yet somehow she had. It, not through presence, but through absence, the absence of nervousness, the absence of deference, the absence of everything he had come to expect from people in her position. Victoria continued speaking, her tone smooth, her words carefully chosen, outlining a charity initiative with just enough detail to sound genuine and just enough restraint to remain impressive, and Daniel nodded at the appropriate moments. But his mind was elsewhere, replaying something small, something insignificant, something he could not quite name. The fork. He had noticed it, not consciously at first, just a flicker of awareness. The way it had been placed, the way it had not been moved immediately, the way it had lingered in a position that did not quite match the person sitting across from him. He shifted his gaze down briefly, then back up, his expression unchanged, but the question had already taken root. Emily approached again, this time with a small adjustment to the table, a refill of water, a quiet presence that did not interrupt, but somehow redirected the energy of the space. "Everything to your liking?" she asked, her voice calm, even, offering nothing beyond the words themselves. "Perfect," Victoria replied quickly, her smile appearing without delay, her hand moving to lift the fork again. And this time Daniel watched, not openly, not obviously, but with the kind of attention that had made him successful, the kind that noticed patterns others dismissed. The movement was smooth, practiced, but there was that fraction of a second again, that almost invisible recalibration. As if the motion had been corrected mid-action, Emily stepped back, her role completed, but her eyes met Daniel's for just a brief moment. And in that moment, something passed between them, not a message, not a signal, but a shared awareness that something had shifted. Daniel did not like uncertainty, but he respected it, because uncertainty meant there was something he had not yet understood. "You are quiet tonight," Victoria said, tilting her head slightly, her tone light but observant. "Just thinking," Daniel replied, his voice measured, giving nothing away. "About business?" she asked. "Always," he said, and it was not entirely untrue, because to him, everything was business, including people, including trust, including the subtle calculations that determined who belonged in his world and who did not. Victoria smiled, satisfied, or perhaps pretending to be, and continued speaking, but Daniel's attention no longer followed her words, it followed her actions, the rhythm of her movements, the alignment of her habits, and for the first time, he began to see what Emily had already seen. In the service corridor, Emily paused for a moment, her hands resting lightly against the counter, her breathing steady, controlled, as she allowed herself a single second to confirm what she already knew. She was not guessing. She was not assuming. She was observing, and observation, when done correctly, left very little room for error. She returned to the dining room with the same quiet confidence, her steps unhurried, her expression unchanged, but her purpose now clearer. Daniel's phone buzzed softly against the table, a message flashing briefly on the screen, but he ignored it, his focus narrowing, sharpening, the way it always did when something important was just beneath the surface. He glanced at Emily again as she passed, and this time, he spoke. "Miss," he said, his tone polite but deliberate. She stopped, turning slightly, her posture straight, attentive. "Yes, sir?" "How long have you been working here?" he asked, the question simple, but the intent behind it anything but. Emily considered him for a fraction of a second, not weighing the answer, but weighing the moment. "Long enough to recognize patterns," she said quietly. Victoria's smile faltered, just for an instant, too quick for most to notice, but not for Daniel. He leaned forward slightly, his interest no longer hidden. "Patterns," he repeated, as if testing the word. Emily nodded once, her gaze steady. "People are consistent, sir, until they have a reason not to be," she said, her voice soft, almost neutral, but the meaning settled heavily in the space between them. Daniel's eyes held hers for a second longer, and in that second, something changed, not dramatically, not visibly, but fundamentally. He was no longer observing out of curiosity. He was observing because he needed to know. Victoria set her glass down with a controlled motion, her fingers tightening ever so slightly around the stem before releasing it. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her tone still smooth, but now carrying an edge that had not been there before. Emily shook her head gently. "Not at all," she replied, stepping back, returning to her role, disappearing once again into the background. But the room did not return to normal, not for Daniel, because once a pattern is broken, it cannot be unseen, and once a question is asked, it does not simply disappear, it waits, quietly, patiently, until someone is ready to hear the answer. The conversation at the table continued, but it had lost its center, like a carefully choreographed performance where one dancer had missed a step and now everyone felt it without knowing why. Daniel Carter no longer followed the words. He followed the spaces between them, the pauses, the micro-expressions, the way Victoria adjusted her posture just before responding, as if aligning herself with an expectation rather than reacting naturally. He had spent years negotiating with people who hid their intentions behind polished language, and he knew that truth rarely lived in what was said, it lived in what slipped through. Victoria lifted her glass again, her fingers precise, her wrist steady, but Daniel's eyes were already there, waiting, and this time he saw it clearly, not just a hesitation, but a correction, a movement that began one way and finished another, subtle, almost elegant, but undeniably inconsistent. He leaned back, his mind shifting gears, no longer social, no longer casual, now analytical, now focused. "You mentioned you studied in Geneva," he said, his tone light, almost conversational, but his eyes did not leave her. Victoria smiled, immediate, flawless. "Yes, for 2 years," she replied. "Interesting," Daniel said, nodding slightly. "Most people who study there pick up certain habits, especially at the table," he added, glancing briefly at the fork before returning his gaze to her face. For a fraction of a second, something flickered, not fear, not exactly, but awareness, the kind that comes when someone realizes they are being observed more closely than expected. "Habits can change," she said smoothly, her voice steady. "Of course," Daniel replied, his tone neutral, but the conversation had shifted, and they both knew it. Across the room, Emily watched without appearing to watch, her movements unchanged, her presence still blending into the rhythm of service. But her attention sharpened, following the exchange with quiet precision. She did not interfere. She did not interrupt, because this was not her moment to speak. It was his moment to see. A server passed by her, whispering something about a delayed order, but Emily barely registered it. Her focus anchored to the table where something fragile was beginning to crack. Daniel reached for his glass. His fingers relaxed, but his mind was not. It was running through possibilities, patterns, inconsistencies, aligning them against what he knew, what he had been told, what he had accepted without question until now. "Tell me something," he said, setting the glass down gently. "How do you usually hold a pen?" The question was simple, almost random, but the silence that followed was not. Victoria tilted her head slightly, her smile returning, but this time it carried a trace of calculation. "I am not sure I understand," she said. "It is a simple question," Daniel replied, his tone still calm, but firmer now, more direct. Emily felt the shift like a change in pressure, subtle but undeniable. Victoria's hand moved toward her napkin, her fingers brushing against it as if grounding herself. "Right-handed," she said finally. Daniel nodded once, slowly. "That is what I thought," he said, his voice quiet, almost reflective, but his eyes dropped briefly to the fork, still resting at a slight angle that did not match the answer he had just received. The room seemed to hold its breath again, not in the obvious way it had when Victoria first entered, but in a quieter, more focused way, as if something important was about to surface. Emily stepped forward once more, carrying a small dish, her timing precise, her movements seamless, and as she placed it on the table, she adjusted the fork again, just slightly, just enough to test the pattern one more time. Victoria's eyes flicked down, her hand moving instinctively, and then stopping, just for a fraction of a second too long. Daniel saw it. Not because he was told to look, not because it was obvious, but because once you start looking for truth, it has a way of revealing itself in the smallest cracks. He leaned forward slightly, his expression no longer casual, no longer polite, but not aggressive either, just focused, intent. "That is interesting," he said softly, more to himself than to anyone else. Victoria's smile tightened, barely perceptible, but real. "What is?" she asked. Daniel looked up, meeting her gaze directly, and for the first time that evening, there was no distance in his eyes, no distraction, no assumption, just attention. "The way you adapt," he said, his voice calm, measured. "It is impressive," he added, and the word hung in the air, ambiguous, unclear whether it was a compliment or something else entirely. Emily stepped back, her role once again complete, but the shift had already happened, the dynamic altered, the balance no longer stable. She moved toward the service station, her expression unchanged, but inside, she knew the next phase had begun, because once doubt enters a room, it does not leave quietly, it grows, it spreads, it reshapes everything it touches. And at that table, between a man who had built his life on certainty and a woman who had perfected the art of control, the smallest detail, a simple fork, had just become the beginning of something neither of them could ignore. Silence did not fall over the table. It settled, slowly, deliberately, like something choosing its place. Daniel Carter did not speak again immediately, and that alone was enough to shift the balance, because he was a man known for decisive words, for clarity, for forward motion, and now he was still, watching, thinking, recalibrating. Victoria Laurent sensed it, not in what he said, but in what he withheld, and her posture adjusted almost imperceptibly, her shoulders aligning, her chin lifting, just a fraction higher, as if reclaiming control of a narrative that had begun to slip. "You are overanalyzing," she said lightly, her voice smooth, almost amused, but there was a precision to it now, a deliberate attempt to reset the tone. Daniel gave a faint smile, the kind that revealed nothing. "That is what I do," he replied, his voice calm. But the words carried weight, because they were not a defense, they were a statement. Emily stood near the edge of the room, her hands resting against the tray she carried, her expression neutral, but her attention fully engaged, not on the tension itself, but on how it moved, how it changed shape, how it revealed more with every second. Victoria reached for her glass again, this time with a touch more certainty, as if aware that she was being observed and determined not to give anything further away. And for a moment, it worked. The movement smooth, controlled, flawless. But control that is forced is never quite the same as control that is natural, and Daniel saw it, not in the movement itself, but in the intention behind it. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, his gaze steady, no longer distracted, no longer divided. "Where did we meet?" he asked suddenly. The question was simple, almost casual, but it landed differently, because it was not about memory, it was about alignment. Victoria blinked once, a small, controlled reaction. "At the charity gala in Boston," she answered without hesitation. Daniel nodded slowly, as if confirming something. "And before that?" he asked. There was a pause this time. Not long, not obvious, but enough. "We spoke briefly at a conference in Zurich," she said, her tone still composed. Emily felt the shift again, sharper now, more defined. Because questions like that were not random, they were directional. They were designed to test continuity, to test consistency. Daniel's fingers tapped lightly against the table, once, twice, a rhythm that matched the way his mind worked when something did not add up. "Interesting," he said quietly, his eyes not leaving hers, "because I do not remember Zurich the same way." Victoria's smile returned, but it was tighter now, less effortless. "Memories can differ," she replied. "Details usually do not," Daniel said. And this time there was no softness in his tone, only clarity. Across the room, a glass shattered softly against the floor, a server dropping it by accident. And for a moment, the attention of the room shifted, but not at this table, not anymore, because something more important was unfolding. Emily moved instinctively to assist with the cleanup, her actions automatic, efficient, but her awareness remained anchored, her mind tracking every word, every reaction, every shift in energy. Victoria placed her fork down deliberately, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the plate. A movement that would have gone unnoticed earlier, but now felt intentional, almost performative. "I think you are letting a server influence your perception," she said, her voice calm, but carrying a subtle edge, redirecting the focus, reframing the situation. Daniel glanced briefly toward Emily, then back to Victoria. "No," he said, his voice steady. "I am letting patterns influence my perception." The distinction mattered, and they both knew it. Emily finished assisting the other server, her hands steady, her movements precise, then returned to the floor, her role unchanged, her presence once again blending into the background. But the atmosphere had shifted beyond repair. Victoria's gaze followed her for a brief moment, her eyes narrowing just slightly, assessing, recalculating. "You trust a waitress over your own judgment?" she asked, the question framed as curiosity, but carrying something sharper beneath it. Daniel did not respond immediately, and in that pause, the answer became clear. "I trust what I see," he said. Finally, his voice quiet, but firm. Victoria leaned back slightly, her composure intact, but her control no longer absolute. "Then perhaps you should look more carefully," she said, her tone smooth, almost challenging. Daniel's expression did not change, but something in his eyes did, something that had not been there before, not doubt, but awareness, the kind that cannot be undone once it begins. Emily passed by their table once more, her steps measured, her presence unobtrusive, and as she adjusted a nearby setting, she did not look at them directly, but she did not need to, because the shift had already happened, the question had already been asked, and the answer was already forming. Because the truth does not arrive all at once. It builds, piece by piece, detail by detail, until the moment when it becomes impossible to ignore. And at that table, between a man who had just begun to question and a woman who had built everything on control, that moment was getting closer with every quiet second. The air at the table had changed in a way that could not be repaired with polite conversation or carefully measured smiles. Daniel Carter no longer played along, and that was something Victoria Laurent could not easily control. He reached for his glass again, but this time it was not the drink that interested him. It was the reflection in the polished surface, the subtle movements that revealed more than direct observation ever could. "Tell me something else," he said quietly, his tone almost thoughtful, as if the conversation had turned into something personal rather than confrontational. Victoria tilted her head slightly, her expression softening just enough to suggest patience. "Of course," she replied. Daniel paused, just long enough to make the question feel intentional. "What was the name of the foundation you mentioned in Boston?" he asked. It was a simple detail, something anyone involved would remember without effort. Victoria's fingers brushed against the edge of the table. A small grounding gesture, almost imperceptible. "The Loran Initiative," she answered smoothly. Daniel nodded once, slowly, but his eyes did not move away from her. "And the director?" he asked. There was that pause again, not long, not obvious, but present. "You met him," she said, redirecting slightly. "I have met many people," Daniel replied, his voice calm, but the precision in his words sharpening. Across the room, Emily moved through her routine, but her awareness remained fixed, not on the words themselves, but on the pattern forming beneath them. She had seen this before, not in this exact setting, not with these exact people, but in the structure of it, the way someone built an identity piece by piece, reinforcing it with details, adjusting it when questioned, maintaining it as long as no one looked too closely. Daniel leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed, but his focus absolute. "You are very good," he said, and for a moment, it sounded like admiration. Victoria smiled, accepting it. "At what?" she asked lightly. Daniel's gaze dropped briefly to the table, to the alignment of the utensils, to the fork that had started all of this, then back to her. "At maintaining consistency," he said. The words landed differently this time, heavier, more defined. Victoria's smile did not disappear, but it changed, just slightly, enough to signal that she understood the shift. "That sounds like a compliment," she said. "It could be," Daniel replied. Emily stepped closer again, her timing precise, carrying a small dish that did not need to be delivered yet, but served a different purpose now. She placed it gently on the table, her movements fluid, her presence unobtrusive, and as she adjusted the setting, she did something small, something almost playful. She rotated the fork once more, but this time she aligned it perfectly straight, neutral, offering no bias, no suggestion. Then she stepped back. Victoria glanced down, her eyes scanning the placement, and for the first time that evening, she did not correct it immediately. Instead, she left it as it was. Daniel noticed, not the action, but the absence of it, and sometimes, absence speaks louder than movement. "You did not fix it," he said quietly. Victoria looked up, her expression composed. "Fix what?" she asked. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering just enough to make the moment feel contained, private. "Even in a crowded room. The detail that has been bothering you all evening," he said. There was a silence then, deeper than before, not the silence of uncertainty, but the silence of recognition. Emily felt it from where she stood, the shift from questioning to knowing, the moment when the pattern no longer needed to be tested, only confirmed. Victoria's hand moved slowly toward the fork, her fingers resting lightly against it. And for a brief second, she seemed to consider, not the object itself, but the implication of touching it. Then she withdrew her hand, leaving it exactly where it was. Daniel's expression did not change, but something in his eyes settled, a conclusion forming, not fully spoken, but no longer avoidable. "You are right," Victoria said softly, her voice smooth, controlled, but carrying a new weight, a subtle acknowledgement that the game had shifted. Daniel watched her, not with anger, not with accusation, but with clarity. "About what?" he asked. Victoria held his gaze, her composure intact, but her control no longer absolute. "People do reveal themselves in patterns," she said. Emily stood still for a moment, her breath steady, her mind quiet, because this was no longer about proving anything. It was about what came next. The room continued around them, conversations rising and falling, glasses clinking, footsteps echoing softly across the floor. But at that table, everything had narrowed to a single point, a single realization that could not be undone. Daniel sat back slowly, his hands resting on the table, his gaze unwavering. "And sometimes," he said, his voice calm, almost reflective, "they reveal more than they intend, Victoria did not respond immediately, and in that pause, everything that had been carefully constructed throughout the evening began to feel fragile, not broken, not yet, but no longer unshakable. And Emily, standing just a few steps away, understood something important, that the truth had already surfaced, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough that it could not be ignored, and once seen, it would change everything that followed. There was no longer a need for raised voices or dramatic gestures, because the truth had already taken its place at the table, quiet, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. Daniel Carter sat still, his gaze steady, not searching anymore, not questioning, but seeing, and that shift alone changed everything. Victoria Laurent held her composure with remarkable precision, her posture flawless, her expression controlled. But the effort behind it had become visible in the smallest ways, in the way her fingers rested too deliberately against the edge of the table, in the way her breathing slowed just a fraction more than necessary, in the way her eyes no longer moved freely but calculated each glance. "You are very perceptive tonight," she said softly, her tone measured, as if acknowledging the moment, without fully surrendering to it. Daniel did not respond immediately, because he no longer needed to fill the silence. He understood its value now. Across the room, Emily Brooks moved as she always did, steady, composed, her presence blending into the rhythm of service, but her attention remained anchored, not to the tension itself, but to its evolution, because what happened next would not come from confrontation. It would come from choice. Daniel reached for the folded napkin beside his plate, unfolding it slowly, his movements calm, deliberate, as if grounding himself in something simple before continuing. "When we first met," he said, his voice even, "you told me something I remember very clearly." Victoria's eyes met his, her expression unreadable. "Did I?" she asked. "You said," Daniel continued, "that authenticity is the only currency that cannot be counterfeited." There was a pause, not of confusion, but of recognition. Victoria's lips curved slightly, a faint echo of the confidence she had carried earlier. "I believe that," she said. Daniel nodded once, but this time there was no agreement in the gesture, only acknowledgement. "Do you?" he asked quietly. The question did not challenge her words, it challenged the space between them. Emily felt it again, that subtle shift, the moment where something internal began to surface, not through force, but through pressure applied in exactly the right place. Victoria's hand moved toward her glass, her fingers wrapping around it with care, as if the motion itself could restore balance. "You are letting small details distort a much larger picture," she said, her tone calm, persuasive, the voice of someone accustomed to guiding conversations back to safe ground. Daniel's eyes did not move. "Details are the picture," he replied. The words settled into the air, quiet but final. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and in that silence, the distance between perception and reality narrowed to almost nothing. Emily stepped forward once more, her presence gentle, unobtrusive, carrying nothing more than a small adjustment to the table. But her timing was precise, arriving not to interrupt, but to complete the moment. She reached for the fork, her fingers light against the polished metal, and instead of rotating it, instead of testing again, she simply lifted it, held it for a brief second, and placed it back down exactly as it had been, leaving it untouched, unchanged, as if to say that nothing more needed to be proven. Daniel watched the movement carefully, not because it revealed something new, but because it confirmed what he already knew. Victoria's gaze followed the motion, her eyes narrowing just slightly, her awareness sharp, because she understood now that the smallest detail had become the center of everything. "You seem very certain," she said, her voice lower now, less performative, more direct. Daniel leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed, but his presence firm. "I am certain of what I see," he said. Emily stepped back, her role complete, her presence once again dissolving into the background, but the impact of her quiet actions remained. Victoria exhaled slowly, a controlled release of tension, her composure still intact, but no longer impenetrable. "And what exactly do you think you see?" she asked. Daniel did not answer immediately, because the answer was not something that needed to be rushed. It was something that needed to be understood. He Looked at her, really looked at her. Not the image, not the persona, but the inconsistencies, the adjustments, the subtle misalignments that no longer fit together. I see someone who has worked very hard to be exactly what I was supposed to believe, he said finally, his voice calm, almost reflective. Victoria held his gaze, her expression steady, but her silence spoke louder than any response could. The room around them continued as if nothing had changed, but at that table, everything had shifted beyond return, because once the illusion is seen for what it is, it does not disappear immediately. It lingers, it resists, but it can no longer hold. And Emily, standing just a few steps away, understood that this was not the end of the moment. It was the beginning of something deeper, because the truth had been revealed quietly, but what followed would depend on what each of them chose to do with it. The moment did not explode. It tightened, like a thread pulled just enough to reveal how close it was to breaking. Daniel Carter remained still, his hands resting lightly against the table, his gaze unwavering, no longer searching for confirmation, but waiting for response, because now the truth was not something he needed to find, it was something she needed to address. Victoria Laurent did not look away, and that alone was telling. Because most people would have deflected, redirected, dismissed. But she stayed, holding his gaze with a steadiness that suggested not innocence, but calculation. You are very confident in your conclusions, she said quietly, her voice no longer soft in the way it had been before, but measured, deliberate, each word placed with care. Daniel tilted his head slightly, considering her tone rather than her words. Confidence is earned, he replied, his voice calm, but firm. Emily Brooks stood at the edge of the room, her presence subtle, almost invisible, but her awareness sharp, following the shift from observation to confrontation, from quiet realization to something more defined. She did not move closer, she did not intervene, because this was no longer her moment to guide, it was their moment to choose. Victoria leaned back slightly in her chair, her posture still composed, but the ease that had once defined her movements had been replaced with precision, with control that felt maintained rather than natural. And what if your confidence is misplaced? She asked, her tone smooth, but carrying a faint edge, not defensive, but testing. Daniel allowed a small pause before answering, not out of hesitation, but intention. Then I will adjust, he said simply. The answer was not confrontational, not aggressive, but it removed any ground she might have had to destabilize him, because it showed he was not invested in being right, only in understanding what was real. Victoria's fingers traced lightly along the rim of her glass, a subtle motion, almost absent-minded, but Emily noticed the tension beneath it, the slight pressure, the controlled release, the signs of someone recalibrating in real time. You built everything on trust, Victoria said after a moment, her voice returning to that familiar persuasive tone, the one that had likely worked in countless rooms before this one. And now you are questioning it over something as small as a habit. Daniel's eyes did not waver. I built everything on patterns, he corrected, his voice quiet, but precise. Trust comes after that. The distinction settled into the space between them, not loudly, but definitively. Emily moved slightly, adjusting a nearby table, her actions routine, her presence unremarkable, but her mind remained engaged, tracking the conversation not for its outcome, but for its direction, because direction revealed intention, and intention revealed truth. Victoria exhaled slowly, a controlled breath, her composure still intact, but the effort now visible in the subtle tightening of her jaw, in the slight delay before her next response. You are letting a stranger influence something that matters, she said, her gaze flicking briefly toward Emily before returning to Daniel. Daniel followed that glance, his eyes resting on Emily for a fraction of a second longer than before, and in that moment, something shifted again, not between him and Victoria, but within him. He saw Emily not as a server, not as part of the background, but as someone who had noticed what he had missed, someone who had seen clearly without needing recognition. He turned back to Victoria. She did not influence me, he said, his voice steady. She showed me where to look. The words landed with quiet weight. Emily lowered her gaze slightly, not out of discomfort, but out of respect for the moment, because acknowledgement was not what she had acted for, but it carried its own significance. Victoria's smile returned, but it was different now, thinner, more controlled. "And what do you think you have found?" she asked. Daniel leaned forward just slightly, enough to close the distance, enough to make the moment feel contained, focused. "Inconsistency," he said. The word was simple, but it carried everything that had built up to this point. Victoria held his gaze, her expression unreadable for a moment longer than before, and then, slowly, something changed, not dramatically, not visibly to most, but enough for Emily to see it, enough for Daniel to feel it. The resistance softened, just slightly, replaced by something else, something closer to acceptance than denial. "You are not wrong," Victoria said quietly. The admission did not come with explanation, did not come with justification, but it shifted the entire dynamic of the room. Daniel did not react immediately, because he understood that truth, when it finally appears, does not need to be forced. It needs to be understood. "Then help me understand," he said, his voice no longer probing, but open, controlled, but willing to move forward. Victoria looked down at the table for a brief moment, her eyes resting on the fork, the object that had revealed more than anything else. And for the first time that evening, she allowed a pause that was not calculated, not controlled, but real. Emily stood still, her breath steady, her mind quiet, because this was the moment where everything could shift. Not through exposure, not through confrontation, but through choice. And in that quiet space, between what had been revealed and what would be said next, the truth waited, not hidden anymore, but no longer protected either, ready to change everything that followed. The admission did not echo. It settled, quiet and irreversible, like a door that had been gently closed behind them. Daniel Carter did not move, did not react with shock or anger, because what he felt was not surprise, it was clarity, the kind that arrives slowly and then all at once. Victoria Laurent lowered her gaze for a brief moment, not in defeat, but in recognition, as if acknowledging that the version of herself she had presented no longer held the same weight in this space. Emily Brooks remained where she was, her presence still, composed, her role complete in the most subtle way possible, because she had not forced the truth into the open, she had simply allowed it to reveal itself. Daniel leaned back slightly, his hands resting on the table, his posture relaxed but grounded, as if recalibrating his understanding of everything that had led to this moment. "Start with something simple," he said quietly, his voice no longer probing, no longer testing, but steady, open. "What is your real name?" The question was direct, but not harsh, and that made it harder to avoid. Victoria exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just a fraction, the first visible sign that she was no longer holding everything in perfect control. "Clara," she said after a moment, her voice softer now, stripped of the polished confidence she had carried before. Daniel nodded once, not in approval, but in acknowledgement, because the truth, even when incomplete, had a different weight than anything else. "And the rest?" he asked. Clara glanced briefly at the fork on the table, the object that had undone her careful construction, and for the first time, there was something almost reflective in her expression. "The rest is complicated," she said. Daniel's gaze remained steady. "It usually is," he replied. There was no judgment in his tone, no accusation, just an expectation that honesty, once started, should continue. Emily shifted slightly, adjusting a nearby setting, her movements quiet, respectful, giving space to what was unfolding, because this was no longer about observation, it was about what someone chose to reveal when they could no longer hide. Clara straightened slightly, not returning to her previous composure, but finding a different kind of balance, one that did not rely on perfection. "I was not supposed to be here," she said, her voice calm, but carrying a trace of something real, something unpolished. "Not in this world, not in your world." Daniel listened without interruption, his attention focused, because this was the part that mattered, not the details of how she had been discovered, but the reason behind it. "Then, why are you here?" he asked. Clara's lips curved slightly, not into a smile, but into something more honest, something that did not try to impress. "Because sometimes," she said, her voice quiet, Being invisible is the only way to get close to something that matters. The words lingered, carrying more meaning than they explained. Emily paused for a fraction of a second, her mind registering the shift. Because this was no longer a performance, it was something else entirely. Daniel's expression did not change, but his eyes sharpened slightly, not with suspicion, but with understanding. "And I mattered?" he asked. Clara met his gaze, and this time, there was no calculation in it, no adjustment, just a straightforward answer. "Yes," she said. The simplicity of it removed any room for interpretation. Daniel leaned back again, his fingers tapping lightly against the table, a habit that returned when he processed information, when he restructured his understanding of a situation. "You built an identity to get close to me," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. Clara nodded once. "And you maintained it," he continued, "through details, through habits, through consistency." "As much as I could," she replied. Daniel's gaze flicked briefly to the fork, then back to her. "Except for the ones you could not control," he said. Clara followed his glance, and for a moment, something almost like amusement touched her expression, not at the situation, but at the precision of it. "Muscle memory is difficult to rewrite," she admitted. Emily allowed herself the smallest exhale, not of relief, but of recognition, because the truth had fully surfaced now, not just in fragments, but in clarity. Daniel was silent for a moment longer, not because he did not know what to say, but because he was choosing what mattered. "And now?" he asked. Clara did not answer immediately, and in that pause, the weight of the moment settled fully into place, because whatever came next would not be about what had been hidden, but about what would be done with what was now known. The room around them continued, unaware, unchanged, but at that table, everything had shifted beyond return, and Emily, standing quietly at the edge of it all, understood that the story had reached a point where truth was no longer the question. Choice was unobtrusive, but her awareness fully engaged, because the conversation had moved beyond subtlety, beyond implication, into something clearer, something that would not easily be undone. Daniel studied Clara for a moment longer, not searching for deception now, but for alignment, for the connection between her words and the patterns he had already seen. "And what exactly were you hired to do?" he asked. Clara did not hesitate this time. "To get close," she said. "To understand how you think, how you decide, what you trust." Daniel's gaze did not waver. "Information," he said. Clara nodded once. "Not numbers," she added. "People." The distinction settled into place, quiet but significant. Daniel's mind moved quickly, not toward anger, but toward structure, toward understanding how something like this could exist within the world he believed he controlled. "And you chose to do it," he said. Clara met his gaze directly. "Yes," she replied. There was no attempt to soften it, no attempt to redirect. Emily felt the weight of that honesty, because it was different from everything that had come before. It was not constructed, it was not adjusted, it was simply stated. Daniel exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in recognition, because the situation was no longer abstract, it was defined, and definition allowed for clarity. "So everything was intentional," he said. Clara shook her head slightly. "Not everything," she replied. Daniel's eyes narrowed just a fraction, not in suspicion, but in curiosity. "Explain that," he said. Clara glanced down at the table, her eyes resting briefly on the fork again, the detail that had unraveled everything. And for a moment, something almost reflective passed through her expression. "You can control actions," she said quietly. "You can control words, timing, reactions, but you cannot control what feels real when it happens." The words hung in the air, carrying more than they explained. Daniel did not respond immediately, because he understood what she was saying, even if he did not yet fully accept it. Emily stood still for a moment, her breath steady, her mind quiet, because this was the point where truth stopped being about facts and started being about meaning. Clara lifted her gaze again, meeting Daniel's eyes with a steadiness that had nothing to do with performance. "I came here with a purpose," she said, "but not everything that happened followed it." Daniel leaned forward slightly, his focus absolute. "And what part did not?" he asked. Clara held his gaze, and for the first time, there was no hesitation at all. You, she said. The word was simple, but it shifted the entire weight of the moment. Emily felt it from where she stood, the change in direction, the movement from strategy to something more complicated, something less predictable. Daniel did not react outwardly, but something in his expression softened, not in trust, not yet, but in recognition that the situation was no longer as clear as it had seemed moments before. The room continued around them, unaware, unchanged, but at that table, the truth had deepened, not just revealing what had been hidden, but raising a new question, not about what had happened, but about what it meant and what would come next. The word did not need repetition. It stayed between them with a quiet weight that neither of them could dismiss. Daniel Carter did not move, but something inside him shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough to alter the way he saw everything that had led to this moment. He had spent years learning how to separate emotion from decision, how to isolate variables, how to build conclusions that could withstand pressure. And yet now, the variable he could not quantify sat directly across from him, calm, composed, and undeniably real. Clara did not look away, and that alone carried meaning, because there was nothing left to perform, nothing left to adjust, only what remained when everything constructed had fallen away. That is not an answer, Daniel said quietly, his voice controlled, but no longer distant. Clara nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the gap between what had been said and what needed to be understood. It is the beginning of one, she replied. Emily Brooks stood near the far side of the room, her posture relaxed, her presence unobtrusive, but her awareness remained anchored to the table, because she understood that what came next would not be about facts, it would be about choices, and choices revealed more about a person than any pattern ever could. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table, his focus narrowing, not on the situation as a whole, but on her, on the person in front of him rather than the role she had played. You said you were hired, he continued, his tone even. You said you had a purpose, and now you are telling me that I changed that. Clara's expression softened, not into vulnerability, but into something more honest, less guarded. I am telling you that the purpose stopped making sense, she said. Daniel's eyes did not leave hers. That does not explain why, he said. Clara exhaled slowly, her gaze dropping for a brief moment before returning, as if choosing the words carefully, not to protect herself, but to ensure they were true. Because you were not what they said you were, she answered. The words settled into the space between them, not loud, not dramatic, but significant. Emily felt the shift again, not as tension, but as clarity, because the narrative had moved from deception to perspective, from manipulation to understanding. Daniel tilted his head slightly, considering her words, not dismissing them, but not accepting them without thought. And what did they say I was? He asked. Clara's lips curved faintly, not into a smile, but into something reflective. Predictable, she said. Calculated, detached, someone who trusts systems more than people. Daniel let out a quiet breath, not quite a laugh, but something close. That sounds accurate, he said. Clara shook her head slightly. It sounds incomplete, she replied. The distinction lingered. Daniel leaned back again, his fingers tapping lightly against the table, the rhythm slower now, less analytical, more contemplative. So you stayed, he said, even after your purpose stopped making sense. Clara nodded. Yes, why? He asked again. And this time the question was not about information, it was about intention. Clara held his gaze, her answer coming without hesitation. Because leaving would have been easier, she said. The simplicity of it carried more weight than anything else she had said. Emily allowed herself the smallest shift in posture, her attention steady, because she understood that truth, when it reached this point, no longer needed to be proven. It needed to be recognized. Daniel studied Clara for a moment longer, not searching for inconsistency now, but for alignment, for the connection between her words and the reality he had begun to see. And what happens now? He asked. Clara did not look away, did not hesitate. That depends on you, she said. The answer was not evasive. It was direct, placing the decision where it belonged. Daniel's gaze flicked briefly to the fork on the table, the object that had revealed everything, and then back to her. No, he said quietly. It depends on what is true from this point forward. The words were not a rejection, but a boundary, a shift from what had been to what could be. Clara nodded once, understanding. Emily stepped forward slightly, not to interrupt, but to complete the moment, placing a final glass of water on the table, her movements calm, deliberate, her presence grounding the space without drawing attention to itself. Daniel glanced at her briefly, and this time, there was something different in his expression, not just recognition, but respect. Emily did not hold the gaze. She simply stepped back, returning to her place, because her role had never been to stay at the center, only to reveal what needed to be seen. The room continued around them, unchanged, unaware, but at that table, something had shifted beyond return, because the truth was no longer hidden, and the only question left was not who they had been, but who they would choose to be now. The moment did not demand urgency. It demanded clarity, and Daniel Carter understood the difference. He remained seated, his posture composed, his gaze steady, but something within him had shifted from evaluation to decision, from observation to direction. He looked at Clara, not as the version she had presented, not as the role she had played, but as the person who now stood in front of him without disguise. Then we start with what is real, he said quietly. Clara held his gaze, her expression calm, but no longer guarded, as if the weight of maintaining something false had finally been lifted. And what is real? She asked. Daniel did not answer immediately, because this was not a question that could be addressed with instinct alone. It required intention. He glanced briefly at the table, at the fork that had revealed everything, and then back at her. What you choose now, he said. The words were simple, but they carried a boundary, a line between what had been constructed and what could be built. Clara nodded slowly, understanding that this was not about explaining the past anymore. It was about defining the future. Emily Brooks stood nearby, her presence quiet, her movement steady, but her awareness remained fully engaged because she recognized this moment for what it was, not the climax, but the turning point, the place where everything either fell apart or began again in a different form. Clara straightened slightly, not returning to the controlled posture she had maintained earlier, but settling into something more natural, something less calculated. Then I will tell you everything, she said. Daniel's expression remained unchanged, but his attention sharpened. Not because you asked, she continued, but because I do not want to continue with anything that is not true. The distinction mattered. Emily felt it, the shift from obligation to choice, because truth offered freely carried a different weight than truth forced into the open. Clara took a small breath, her eyes steady. I was brought into this through a network that studies influence, she said, her tone clear, no longer evasive. Not just financial influence, but behavioral, decision-making patterns, the way certain individuals shape outcomes without appearing to. Daniel listened without interruption, his focus absolute. And you were one of those individuals, she added. Daniel nodded once, not in surprise, but in acknowledgement, because he had always known that his position came with attention, even if he had not fully considered the forms it might take. They wanted to understand how you think, Clara continued. What variables you trust, what signals you respond to, what makes you change direction. Daniel's fingers rested still against the table, his mind absorbing each word, not reacting emotionally, but restructuring the framework of what he now understood. And what did you learn? He asked. Clara paused for a brief moment, not out of hesitation, but to ensure her answer was precise. That you are not as predictable as they believed, she said. Daniel's gaze did not shift. And what else? He asked. Clara's expression softened slightly, not with emotion, but with clarity. That you notice more than you show, she replied. The words carried a quiet acknowledgement, one that shifted the dynamic between them, from opposition to understanding. Emily adjusted a nearby setting, her movements fluid, her presence grounding the space without interrupting it, because she understood that this was no longer about uncovering truth, it was about accepting it. Daniel leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed, but his mind focused. And yet, he said, I did not notice this. Clara followed his glance to the fork, then back to him. You did, she said quietly. You just did not have a reason to question it until now. The statement lingered, carrying A subtle truth about perception and attention. Daniel considered it, then nodded once, slowly. And now that I do, he said, everything looks different. Clara did not disagree. Emily stepped forward once more, placing a final detail on the table, a small adjustment that completed the setting, her movements calm, deliberate, as if closing a chapter without drawing attention to it. Daniel's gaze shifted briefly to her again, and this time, the respect was unmistakable, not because of what she had said, but because of what she had not needed to say. Clara noticed it too, the subtle acknowledgement, and something in her expression changed, not with tension, but with understanding, because she recognized that the smallest action in the room had carried the greatest impact. Daniel returned his attention to her. So this was never about me as a person, he said. Clara shook her head gently. It started that way, she replied, but it did not stay that way. The words settled between them, quiet but significant. Daniel exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in acceptance, because the situation was no longer something to resist. It was something to understand. The room around them continued as it always had, unaware, unchanged. But at that table, everything had shifted into something new, something no longer defined by deception, but by what remained when the truth was fully seen. And Emily, standing just beyond the center of it all, understood that what came next would not be shaped by what had been hidden, but by what each of them chose to do now that nothing was. The night did not end with a dramatic conclusion. It settled into something quieter, something more permanent, like a truth that no longer needed to prove itself. Daniel Carter remained seated for a moment longer after the conversation had naturally come to its close, his gaze resting not on Clara, not on the table, but somewhere in between, as if recalibrating the way he understood not just the evening, but the patterns he had trusted for years. Clara sat across from him, no longer performing, no longer adjusting, simply present, her posture relaxed in a way that had not been possible before, as if the absence of pretense had given her something she had not expected to find. Neither of them rushed to stand. Neither of them reached for a conclusion, because what had shifted between them was not something that could be resolved in a single moment. Emily Brooks moved quietly through the room, her work nearly complete, her presence as steady as it had been from the beginning. But now there was a subtle difference, not in what she did, but in how she was seen. Daniel glanced toward her again, and this time, the recognition was not just awareness, it was understanding, the kind that acknowledged that the smallest action could change the entire direction of a story. He stood slowly, his movements calm, deliberate, and Clara followed, mirroring the simplicity of his motion rather than the precision she had maintained earlier. For a brief moment, they stood across from each other without words, and in that silence, something new began to form, not built on assumption, not built on roles, but on what had been revealed when everything else had fallen away. "Walk with me," Daniel said quietly, his tone not commanding, not transactional, but open. Clara studied him for a fraction of a second, not questioning the invitation, but understanding its meaning, and then she nodded. They moved toward the exit together, not as they had entered, not defined by expectation or control, but by something more balanced, something still uncertain, but real. Emily watched them go, her expression unchanged, her presence steady, and as she turned back to clear the final table, her hand brushed lightly against the fork, aligning it without thought, without intention, because the moment it had carried had already passed. Outside, the air was cooler, quieter, the city stretching out in its usual rhythm, unaware of what had shifted within the walls behind them. Daniel paused just beyond the entrance, his gaze moving briefly across the streetlights, the passing cars, the familiar world that now felt slightly different. Clara stood beside him, not speaking, not filling the silence, allowing it to exist without pressure. "You could have left," Daniel said after a moment, his voice calm, reflective. Clara looked at him, her expression steady. "So could you," she replied. The simplicity of it carried a quiet truth. Daniel allowed a faint smile, not out of amusement, but recognition. "I do not usually stay when something does not align," he said. Clara's lips curved slightly, a hint of something warmer, less guarded. "Neither do I," she answered. The exchange did not resolve anything, but it Did not need to, because what had been established was not certainty, but possibility. Daniel turned slightly, facing her more directly now. His posture relaxed in a way that suggested he was no longer measuring every outcome. Then maybe we both made an exception, he said. Clara held his gaze, and for the first time, there was no trace of calculation in her eyes, only clarity. Maybe we did, she replied. The moment lingered, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but steady, grounded, the kind that did not demand attention but held it anyway. Daniel glanced back toward the restaurant briefly, as if acknowledging the place where everything had shifted, then returned his attention to her. There is something I need to learn, he said. Clara raised an eyebrow slightly, curious. What is that? She asked. Daniel's expression softened, not with vulnerability, but with honesty. How to see what I missed before, he said. Clara considered him for a moment, then nodded. That is not something you learn alone, she replied. Daniel's gaze held hers, and this time, there was no distance in it. Then do not let me, he said quietly. The words were simple, but they carried an intention that extended beyond the moment. Clara did not answer immediately, but she did not look away either, and in that quiet space between question and response, something settled into place, not defined, not labeled, but undeniable. And as they began to walk, side by side, not rushed, not directed, but aligned in a way that had not existed before, the night carried forward around them, unchanged and yet entirely different, because sometimes the most important shifts do not happen when someone speaks louder, they happen when someone finally chooses to see, and in that choice, everything else follows. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Love After Everything for more powerful and emotional journeys. Your support helps us keep bringing touching, meaningful stories to life. Stay with us, you never know which story might change everything.